All right. So, to preface this, Matt Walsh is very upset that the statue of Robert E. Lee is getting melted down and turned into another statue. And frankly, I just think it'll be fun to dunk on Matt Walsh for a while for supporting the Confederacy. So, here we go.
Nearly a century, a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee stood in Charlottesville, Virginia. In 1997, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which meant that at the time, and this again was in the 90s, so not all that long ago, it was considered worthy of preservation for both its historical significance and its artistic value. Little over 20 years later, in the midst of public hysteria over the overdose death of a criminal drug addict in Minneapolis, that 100-year-old work of art, which was supposed to be preserved, was instead torn down.
By the way, when he says that 100-year-old work of art, do you think that was erected, like, I don't know, like immediately following the Civil War by like the morning people who had lost family in the Civil War who wanted to like commemorate Robert E. Lee's I don't know, keeping alive of their boys.
We love you, Jack.
Kyrie, thank you for the 3 gifted tier 1 subs. I appreciate it immensely. Thank you for helping me to continue living. Genuinely and deeply appreciate it. Those donos are what make it possible for me to live, because ad revenue does not at all. But yeah, for the record, this was the statue was put up in 1924. Okay, it was put up in 1924, and yeah, it's I don't know how reflective of historical, I don't know, goodness, we'll say, it is. Yeah, just right off the bat, I'm gonna say, Robert E. Lee was terrible, and fuck him. Fuck him, and fuck the Confederacy.
And we were told, move to a museum. Well, last week, the museum, in a symbolic humiliation ritual, melted the statue down and destroyed it. It will
Hell yeah.
now be repurposed as an inclusive arts display. This is how we treat our art and our historic monuments these days.
I do like, just real quick.
Well, last week, the museum, in a symbolic humiliation ritual, melted the statue down and destroyed it.
You know, I'd argue, of all the things to, have a humiliation ritual about, humiliating Confederates and the Confederacy, a rebellion against America in order to preserve slavery, I think that should be humiliated. That deserves a humiliation ritual of some sort. And if you are still supportive of the Confederacy in 2023, you should be humiliated. You should be laughed at in the streets and mocked relentlessly. And I think that would be good, actually. I think we would live in a better world if we lived in one in which, like, people who are really pro-Confederacy were mocked mercilessly. Yeah, you should be ashamed for supporting a state explicitly founded on slavery and rebellion against the United States that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Yeah, you should be ashamed. Yeah, states' rights to do what?
It will now be repurposed as an inclusive arts display. This is how we treat our art and our historic monuments these days. It's especially how we treat historical figures like...
I mean, it's worth noting that this isn't how we treat the vast majority of our art and historical figures. The vast majority of our art and historical figures aren't symbolically melted down because they're emblematic of slavery.
Robert E. Lee, but it wasn't always this way. Going back now to the early to mid 19th century, for more than 3 decades
I wonder what happened in the early to mid 19th century.
during that span, Robert E. Lee served as an officer in the U.S. military. He graduated from West Point, went on to play a key role in the Mexican-American War, which is a war that isn't talked about very much these days, even though it changed the country forever. And at the end of it, Mexico ceded a lot of territory, including California, Utah, Nevada, a lot of what we now call Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And Lee's role in that victory earned him a series of major promotions. He was eventually named the superintendent of West Point, which was the military academy he once attended. Just a few years after Lee left that post, the state of Virginia, where Lee was born, seceded from the Union. And at that point, Lee had a decision to make.
And he decided to cast in his lot with a bunch of traitors to his country, and who were explicitly fighting to preserve the ability to own human beings, largely predicated on the color of their skin. So, yeah.
He could accept a post with the Union Army, leading the Union Army, in fact, which was offered to him by Lincoln, or he could defend his home state, which, and you know, if he decided to take the other option and to join the Union, then he would be marching against his state, his community, his family, even his own sons. It would mean taking up the sword against his own family. Now, even though Lee was no great fan of either slavery or the idea of secession, he chose to defend his state and his family instead. In the end, he felt a greater loyalty to his state and to his community and to his family than he did to the federal government. And back in those days, that's how a lot of people felt. He resigned from the U.S. military, joined the Confederacy, and won some of the most pivotal battles of the war, often when he was up against very long.
He won some of the most pivotal battles of the war. How did he win those battles, Matt? How did he win those battles exactly? Did he win them by killing American soldiers? I just cannot understand. I cannot fathom, like, the idea of, like, yeah, he was a pretty great guy. You know, sure, he was responsible for the deaths of, like, over 100,000 Americans, but that was good, actually. It was really good and honorable that he was responsible for that. Like, I don't know, like, if some random guy, in order to preserve, like, the prison labor system in the modern day, like, drove a van full of fertilizer and, like, blew up like a high rise that was full of people and killed, like, you know, 1,000 people, or, like, leveled a city block in New York. Like, no one's going to hail that guy a hero. But Matt Walsh is over here being like, you know, when Robert E. Lee did it, though, it was actually pretty cool.
Long odds. After the war, Lee became a college professor, and he worked to unify the North and South until his death. He was remembered across political lines for many, many decades as both an ingenious tactician and a man of principle and faith.
Yeah. Ignore all the people that he got killed, though, and also ignore all of the people who fought against his armies. You know, just ignore those people. Everyone else who wasn't directly involved thought he was pretty cool and debonair, I guess.
Churchill called him one of the best generals in history. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States and former commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, had this to say about Robert E. Lee. Listen. Now, a few years later, a dentist wrote to Eisenhower and wrote him a letter demanding to know why he had that picture of Robert E. Lee in his office. And this is part of Eisenhower's response. He said, quote, "He believed unswervingly in the constitutional validity of his cause, which until 1865 was still an arguable question in America. He was a poised and inspiring leader. From deep conviction, I simply say, a nation of men of Lee's caliber would be unconquerable in spirit and soul." Now, for the next few decades, most Americans agreed with that assessment. In the 90s, we had movies venerating Robert E. Lee, starring Martin Sheen, and nobody lost their minds over it. The Lee statue and statues like it stood in town squares all over the country, especially in the South. It wasn't an issue. They weren't vandalized. There were no angry mobs demanding their removal.
I wonder why. I wonder why in post-Civil War times, and then in the Jim Crow South, people weren't organizing angry mobs to remove them. Can anyone think of why that might be? You know, if you need some hints, maybe look up Emmett Till on Wikipedia, or, you know, the destruction of Black Wall Street, just as a couple of examples of why people might not have organized, that you know, statues might not have been the most pressing issue on their minds. I wonder.
Most people, including those who certainly cannot be described as Confederate sympathizers, recognize that the Civil War was fought at a different time in a different era, and there were noble men on either side. That's how most people viewed it for decades and decades. But somewhere along the line, just the past few years, everything changed. Statues of Robert E. Lee and anyone like him had to come down, we were told. They had to come down right away. Okay, there was no time to talk about.
Yeah, I wonder if there's anything about that had something to do with several prominent state killings of black citizens. I wonder if it had anything to do with that and the subsequent, like, you know, mass protests that happened.
About it. There was no time to debate. You weren't allowed to debate. In fact, you weren't even allowed to express any of the viewpoints that nearly everyone held for 100 years before that. These statues were not a problem for 100 years. But
I wouldn't say that. I don't know. I think people brought up the fact that, like, William Bedford Forrest was, like, one of the founders of the KKK, and that it wasn't really cool that there were entire, like, towns named after him, and, like, statues dedicated to him, and things named after him. Pretty sure people brought that up, actually.
But in the last
Nathan Bedford Forrest. Did I say William? My bad.
100 seconds, they became a problem. And it was our duty to simply watch as they were all toppled and carried away. Now, already, if you're a perceptive and insightful person, you might ask yourself, was this a sign of progress?
Yes. Yes. America catching up to mass shame people who support the Confederacy. Yeah, that is a sign of progress. It's progress we should have made in, like, you know, the 1880s. But, you know, I'll take it now.
Like, was this a good sign when we started going around and had angry mobs tearing down all these statues that had been there for a century and nobody complained, and then all of a sudden we had to take them down? Was this a sign that things were heading in a good direction in our country? Were we a better country back when a man like Robert E. Lee was widely respected? Or were we a better country when we decided that we could not have any acknowledgement of him in any public place? Which version of the country was better? Which version of the country had greater racial harmony? Was it the one back in the 90s when Robert E. Lee statues were being preserved as historic monuments? Or the one in the 2020s? What do you think? Now, to make the contrast even more clear, the media did not elevate voices as articulate as Churchill or Eisenhower to make the case against the Robert E. Lee monuments. Instead, they thrust BLM activists like Ziana Bryant in our faces. And here was her argument. This is from 2 years ago, talking about this same monument. Here's what she said.
Ziana, I know you've heard this argument.
You know, this, by the way, a lot of this is pretty rich coming from Matt Walsh, a guy who, you know, for someone who is just against humiliation rituals, just as a reminder, ritualistically did a humiliation with this book called Toxic Talk back in 2010.
You just don't judge us for this.
How'd the Nazis do this?
You wait until we learn how to use fire. We're gonna burn our damn fingers off. Oh, there we go. Boom! There's you some taxation. You just don't judge us.
Yeah, this guy really has some nuanced takes about humiliation rituals. He humiliates himself for a living.
Before, I'm hoping that you could go ahead and tell critics who feel like removing the statue is whitewashing history and a section of our history that we should be engaging with, and by removing it, we're acting as though it didn't happen, or we're trying to erase a section of our history. What do you say to those folks?
I would say actually erecting these monuments is whitewashing our history. At the time of emancipation, Charlottesville and the surrounding area was majority Black. And you don't see that narrative by having Confederate monuments standing in the center of parks, towering over whole communities. What you see a romanticized version of the South. You see memorabilia that makes people feel good about the Civil War, but it doesn't tell the story of the South losing. It doesn't tell the story of the Confederacy falling. And so I think that we cannot erase history. We can't edit it. In fact, history already happened. So people can Google, people can use textbooks. There are many other resources. There are whole museums that teach people about those legacies and about the history of what happened here. But what I think we're doing with removing these statues is we're no longer offering a platform for white supremacy. And I think that by deplatforming and decentering those harmful narratives that perpetuate violence and that perpetuate oppression is one of the most powerful things that we can do.
Fair. Yeah, I think that's good.
My lord. So again, ask yourself, are we a better country when people like that, when their arguments are prevailing, or when, when we're listening to Dwight D. Eisenhower and Churchill and those guys?
Churchill, who did a genocide against the people of India? That Churchill? Look, dude. We can erect statues to whoever we want, and we live in a democracy. If the people who live in that area don't want that statue to be there, you don't have the ability to force them to keep that statue there. Statues generally reflect the values of the communities they're erected in, and turns out the community that lives there doesn't want a statue of Robert E. Lee reflecting their values, because he doesn't reflect their values. Good on the people who live there good on them, because they've grown beyond the need to, performatively venerate a guy who killed hundreds of thousands of Americans in order to try and preserve the ability to own Black people as property. So good on them. That's actually progress, Matt. Something Matt abhors.
She says the monument was supposed to make people feel good about the Civil War. What? Is that what you think monument?
You literally spent like the first 5 minutes of this video sucking Robert E. Lee's dick. Yeah. I think it was pretty effective, Matt.
Monuments are meant to do. Nobody feels good about the Civil War. What do you mean feels good about it? When have you ever heard that opinion expressed? What do you think about the Civil War? Oh yeah, I felt great about it. I feel really great.
You literally spent the first 5 minutes of this video talking about how great Robert E. Lee was. And how well he led his troops in battle, how honorable, how debonair, how people liked him, as opposed to talking about what he actually did during the Civil War, which was kill hundreds of thousands of Americans.
I'm happy. So I feel good. That doesn't even make any sense. Okay, monuments don't exist to make us feel good about the wars that they
exist to give us a certain impression of certain events and people and places, Matt. They exist to communicate something to both people who live in the community and to people outside of the community. That's how art works, Matt. And it's not surprising that Matt doesn't understand this about art. at all, considering he works for the Daily Wire, and the Daily Wire is one of the most creatively bankrupt places I've ever seen. Like, we went over their like kids show releases, and they're all so derivative that there might be a lawsuit from like the creators of Bluey against the Daily Wire, which would admittedly be very funny.
They are remembering. But they do exist to remember, because these are events that we should remember.
Yeah, because without Robert E. Lee, no one would know about Robert. Without the Robert E. Lee statue, no one would ever hear about him. Well, what if there are other people we could erect statues of that deserve to be remembered even more than Robert E. Lee? You know, what if that's the case? What if there are people who lived back then that would be more worth remembering? People like Sitting Bull, or Harriet Tubman, or like, there are a lot of other historical figures from that day who did not lead hundreds of thousands of Americans to their deaths on the battlefields of the Civil War. John Brown, an excellent person to commemorate. Sherman, another wonderful person to commemorate. Burned his way to the sea and ended the last gasp of a dying slave state. Good on him.
People always say, happy dog, happy life. Well, if that's really the case, you need to be giving your dog rough greens. Naturopath.
God, I would not buy... I know this is an ad and we're going to skip it, but I would not buy dog food from someone like Matt Walsh, because there's like a 90% chance that food would be spiked with like arsenic or something. I do not trust Matt Walsh providing food to any dog under my care.
More. Bryant became famous for destroying the life of a University of Virginia student with a false accusation of racism. So that's the person that we're consulting on issues like this. But for a second, let's put aside what a horrible person Ziona Bryant is. Let's listen to...
Citation needed, Matt? You have like graphics and stuff you could throw on screen. Let's see here. I'm not seeing anything about false accusation, question mark? Okay, so Zaya Bryant claimed she heard a fellow UVA student named Morgan Bettinger say that protesters would make good speed bumps in 2020, which was 3 years ago, and she's 22 now, so this would have been when she was 19. A student disciplinary hearing found Bettinger guilty of making a legal threat against protesters. A second probe, however, found that Bryant more than likely didn't hear the words coming out of Bettinger, and her evidence was shaky at best. Then how did the initial disciplinary hearing find that she was guilty? If it was literally a he said she said situation, or a she said situation, like how did they find her initially guilty? Wait, Bettinger did admit during a student misconduct trial that she had said something similar to a truck driver that was blocking the road. She insisted she hadn't said it as a threat. So she did say it. She did actually say that protesters would make good speed bumps. Okay, yeah, nah, she just wasn't saying it as a threat. Okay. Yeah, all right. Yeah, this isn't exactly the gotcha that Matt Walsh thought it was.
To the argument again that she
no wonder he didn't show receipts.
Making 2 years ago on behalf of BLM. She's supposedly not objecting to the existence of the statue of Robert E. Lee, at least not explicitly. Instead, she's saying that it doesn't belong in a prominent public place, that it shouldn't stand in the center of parks towering over whole
Holly
communities.
Hoops.
She insists that there are, quote, whole museums that people can go to if they want to see statues like this one.
It's true.
Maybe people can even Google pictures of the statue if they're so inclined.
It's true. You can go to a museum, Matt. Museums exist.
Now, whatever the case, the argument was that BLM isn't trying to erase history or denigrate this nation's heroes or mock
You could also just open a history textbook, Matt.
white people for honoring one of the most brilliant generals in the history of the
But this is a little bit of inside baseball. Matt Walsh doesn't want to recommend to his audience that they should read a history textbook, okay? He doesn't want that to happen ever. So, yeah, reminding people that they could just read about historical events, why that's something that is counter to Matt Walsh's mission.
country. No, they're not doing any of that. They're just trying to put everything in its proper historical context. The Lee statue doesn't tell the story of the Confederacy failing, she complains, as if the role of a statue is to explain 19th century history in detail.
Okay, then why are you trying to say that the statue should be there to explain how great Robert E. Lee was? Like your argument is literally, if we don't have a Robert E. Lee statue, we're going to forget about Robert E. Lee. That's your argument, Matt. Your argument is that the statues are there to explain history.
There were a lot of black people in Virginia, she goes on to say, and Lee was not black. And therefore, this statue needs to come down and go to a museum where it belongs. Now, none of that made any sense at the time, unless, of course, the goal was never to move the statue of Robert E. Lee, but instead to destroy it entirely. If that was the intent, then everything just went according to plan. As I said at the top,
Well, as you said at the top, the museum it was donated to decided to melt it down, Matt. That's what you said at the top.
And university faculty members, with the help of local legislators, just melted down the statue of Robert E. Lee in secret in an undisclosed location, after saying for years that they just wanted to move it to a museum. But they forgot to mention...
Well, the museum didn't say that they were just going to move it to the museum. The museum made the decision after it was moved to the museum. Like, oh man, these tears are delicious, dude.
Is that the museum they move it to is then going to take it and destroy it. Now, they won't even say what state this destruction
Also good. Fuck that statue.
occurred in.
And
But
fuck the
leftists who
Confederacy.
demolished Lee's statue made sure to release a video of it happening. Here it is, watch.
Oh, he's gonna cry. Excellent. That's some quality statue smelting.
Okay, so they not only removed the statue, they not only destroyed it, but they melted it and took a video of it and made sure to publish the video. They gave an inanimate statue of a Civil War general the Terminator treatment. They melted it down and filmed.
They didn't give it the Terminator treatment. That's just how you melt down a statue. It's not like they were trying to figure out the most heinous way to destroy the statue. That's how you melt down a hunk of metal, okay? Like, I mean, I think it's great, but next time you can just throw that shit in a volcano. All right?
After this video, can we watch this pretty please?
I'm not, no, we have so much to do today.
It. Now, why did they do that exactly? It wasn't to make the area safer for anyone. In fact, just a few days ago, a black male was murdered by another black male.
Also, this is an hour long. I do love Adon Shea films, though.
Short distance from where the statue used to be. So it doesn't seem like the area is now suddenly safer. So what's the real purpose of all this?
It's to communicate a different narrative about the location and what the people of this area care about, Matt.
Well, here's one big clue. All those images of the statue being melted down were accompanied by a lot of gloating. The Washington Post, for example, spoke to the executive director of Charlottesville Black History Museum, who said, quote, Well, they can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's according to Andrea Douglas, the museum's executive director, as she watched pieces of oxidized metal descend into the furnace. There will be no tape for that, she says.
Also, just as an FYI, it's actually not that uncommon to pull down undesired statues. Okay, like it's a thing that happens. You know, people just don't really like certain historical figures,
recovery vehicle.
and they pull down statues
One
of them.
over-exuberant Marine couldn't resist a bit of flag-waving patriotism first. The stars and stripes.
I gotta be honest with you guys. This should have been what we did with every single Confederate statue in America.
Stripes were taken down and replaced by the Iraqi flag. Then the moment of history. Saddam's regime could finally be said to be at an end.
There it goes. There we go.
That should have been every Confederate statue.
The Post went on to interview another UVA activist behind this destruction who said, quote, Jelaine Schmidt, this is reading out from the article, Jelaine Schmidt, who directs the Memory Project at UVA's Karsh Institute of Democracy, said she felt like she was preparing for an execution of sorts. Like if there's a rabid dog in the neighborhood that's been hurting people and it needs to be euthanized, she said. Schmidt also said, quote, we want to transform it into a piece of art that community can be proud of and gather around and not feel excluded or intimidated. Yes, because of course, when you euthanize a rabid dog, you put it in a furnace and everyone gathers around and celebrates it. They won't be intimidated anymore.
I know that, like, you all don't need me to say this, but, like, clearly Matt Walsh needs someone to say this to him. But, like, when somebody says something feels like something, they're talking about how it makes them feel. Like, you know, and the feeling analogy that they might be kind of messy and might not make a ton of, like, logical sense. But it's there to convey a certain feeling, Matt. And Matt Walsh doesn't understand feelings or concepts like love. So that's part of the problem here.
Okay, what kind of dog euthanasia has this person been a part of? But it all makes perfect sense, right? Turning the Lee statue into an inclusive art display, it's not a humiliation ritual at all.
Yeah, isn't he in favor of public executions? Yeah. Dude has literally said we need to bring back, like, firing squads and like televise them. Okay? And, like, make them public. like dude's saying that, but he can't handle a statue being melted down.
We're supposed to believe. We're also supposed to believe that the statue was hurting people. Well, how was it hurting people? What was it doing to them? Was it coming alive like Night at the Museum and assaulting innocent civilians in the middle of the night? What kind of damage?
Well, you know, there's a hurt of feelings that can happen. You know, like, I don't know, say, like, a murderous warlord came through and killed 90% of your people and then erected a statue of himself in your neighborhood. And then everyone was just like, man, what a great guy that murderous warlord was. Wasn't it really great when he killed a bunch of people and, like, he was really good at it. So, you know, that's pretty cool. And people liked him at the time. And you were, like, one of the people who, like, lost family members or, you know, that murderous warlord was fighting to keep you and your people as, you know, slaves. Maybe, like, the descendants of formerly enslaved people wouldn't feel super cool about that warlord statue in their neighborhood, you know, 150, 200 years later. You know, just throwing that idea out there.
Was it causing? And why didn't anyone ever notice this damage or mention it for the first.
They did. They have this conversation has been in the zeitgeist like since the civil rights era. You just don't pay any fucking attention to it, Matt.
First 8 or 9 decades of the statue's existence.
Also, people probably heavily objected to it, you know, in the Jim Crow era, but you know, in the South, the prominent demographic of people who would have been objecting to it were black. And you know what happened in the South to prominent black people with little to no political or economic power? You know, there was an entire group of people dedicated to, like, teaching uppity black folk their rightful place, called the KKK, Matt. Maybe, yeah, I mean, I don't need to tell Matt that. He's very familiar with the KKK.
Why are people in the 2020s more hurt?
Can he play banjo? Yes, but the only thing he can play on the banjo is Deliverance.
By Civil War memorials than people
For
who
obvious
lived
reasons.
closer to the Civil War were. Okay? How did the wounds of the Civil War become fresher over time? How is some...
They didn't, but I'm just throwing this out there. The wounds of the Civil War probably weren't helped with their healing when, like, 60-ish years after it, people started putting up these statues to let black people know that they weren't welcome in their towns. Something that gained steam in the 1920s and, like, heavily escalated into the 50s and 60s in response to the civil rights era. So Matt is just kind of glossing over this and relying on his audience's ignorance of history in order to reinforce their own bigoted beliefs. Or, you know, maybe his audience isn't bigoted. Maybe they're just ignorant, okay? And that's probably also why he's not recommending they read any books, because books, to people in Matt Walsh's audience, to Matt Walsh, dangerous. If his audience started reading history textbooks, hoo boy, his numbers would go down fast.
20-something-year-old in the year 2023, how is it that for them, it's like too soon for the Civil War? We can't have Civil War acknowledgement anywhere. It's too soon. And yet it wasn't in the 1930s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s.
The majority of these statues that he's, you know, talking about how amazing they are, were erected in, like, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You know, in direct opposition to a growing call for the end of Jim Crow and for civil rights for African Americans.
None of this makes any sense until you realize that the campaign to tear down Confederate statues was always, from the very beginning, a proxy in the overall war on American history. They just can't be honest about it because...
Interestingly, in this entire thing about American history, he never once suggests his audience read a history book. There are a lot of them. Never suggests his audience look up any of the relevant facts. Never provides any citations for what he's talking about. Again, he's relying on his audience to basically be like, oh yeah, that's Matt Walsh. He's basically the crazy guy down at the hardware store who just seems wise and says insane gibberish that I believe without question.
They're never honest about anything. And all the deception is necessary in this case because these activists have much bigger plans. They never planned to stop with melting down the Robert E. Lee statue, and they haven't. Indeed, the Lee statue is far from the only statue that's been destroyed, of course, or essentially destroyed in recent years. According to an investigation from the Madrid newspaper El País, the city of Richmond maintains a secret...
Why are you getting your news on Richmond, Virginia from a Madrid-based newspaper? Okay, we have one citation, and it's absolutely baffling.
Secret open-air graveyard for statues that were toppled in 2020. And these statues are disassembled and thrown into storage. A lot of contractors apparently passed on these disassembly.
I do have to look this up. El País. Civil War statues. Okay. I have to allow ads. Can do that. Okay. Accept. There we go. Richmond took down its racist statues, but now the city doesn't know what to do with them. In a secret warehouse in the old capital of the Confederacy, authorities store monuments that were removed from public places during the 2020 anti-racism protests. El País received exclusive access to the location where the fate of these objects is being decided. Okay. Richmond's racist past, torn in pieces, awaits its future. Stacked up in a wasteland next to the river that... You know, just keep them there. Honestly. Just keep them in the wasteland next to the river. Open air industrial area. The remains of the Confederate statues lie. They were removed from the streets by the Richmond City Council in the aftermath of the protests that broke out in May 2020, following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I do have to say, right, it is super telling, right, that Matt Walsh is super against, like, the democratic will of the people of Richmond, Virginia, right? Because the people of Richmond, Virginia vote on who's on their city council. And their city council decided time to remove these goddamn statues because they are so racist. Why a Spanish newspaper? I guess they have an English version? I have no idea. This is very strange, but... see. Oh, hey. Richmond was the capital of the secessionist and slave-owning American South. City of 230,000 residents recently transferred ownership of the fallen memorials of Confederate generals and politicians to the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. It's now up to the institution to decide what to do with them. Okay, so basically the residents of Richmond voted to transfer these statues to this specific museum, and there are just so many goddamn racist statues that the museum is deciding some of them should be melted down. Yeah. Oh, wait. That the decision will be made in agreement with the community. We're already surveying the residents, she notes. That she doesn't want the statues in the museum's headquarters, a former barracks that housed Virginia's first detachment of black soldiers. The statues are too big for our space. They would require us to strengthen security against possible attacks by white supremacist groups, she adds. So literally one of the reasons that they are melting down these statues is because they're afraid of attacks by white supremacists. Which, I'll remind you guys, Charlottesville was full of people who ostensibly showed up to defend the honor and integrity of these statues. And, you know, were just Klansmen. Or Nazis. So, first of all, any of the destruction that is being done here is being run past the residents of Richmond, Virginia. And second of all, they can't display most of these because they're afraid of attacks by white supremacists. Yeah, they like, the white supremacists and Nazis literally killed a woman during Charlottesville. They're right to be worried in the former capital of the Confederacy. Another certainty is that the rush to tear them down will not influence the speed of the subsequent steps taken by the authorities. It will take us a long time. I estimate at least 5 years, maybe 10, Lauderdale explains. as she walks among the stone blocks that form the pedestals of the monuments. So, okay, they aren't like rushing to destroy these statues even, and this story is from 2023. Yeah, from earlier this year. So, Matt Walsh is literally crying about the hypothetical possibility that they're going to melt down all of these statues. And he's crying about one of the statues being melted down as agreed upon by the local community. Disassembly and storage was done by Devin Henry, a young black contractor in 2020. Received a call. Let's see, I had to think about it a lot, above all because of my family, because of the violence and hatred sparked the controversy with the statues. In the end, I made up my mind, if we don't do it now, if I didn't do it, perhaps what we descendants of enslaved people have been chasing for decades would never come. Later, he learned that 24 companies rejected the offer before he accepted it. Literally, so many people felt threatened in this area by the white supremacy that 24 companies refused to help disassemble these statues and store these statues. In the end, I made up. Oh wait, yeah, here we. Wait, no. Yes. Henry says that every time he was asked to remove a statue, the authorities gave him 24-hour security. He had to go to work wearing a bulletproof vest. In addition, he obtained a weapon license to feel protected. Every time we removed one statue, the calls and messages on the answering machine rained down with threats like, quote, "Hello, we're from the Ku Klux Klan. You knocked down our memories. Now it's our turn to go after you and yours. When this article is published, we'll definitely receive a few more." Dude's brave. Dude is brave as hell. Meanwhile, Matt Walsh is just over here. They're burning up the statues. How will people remember the precious Confederacy? A boo-hoo-hoo. A boo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Like, he's upset. No wonder, by the way, no wonder Matt Walsh did not want to provide any citations for this story and waited until he was 16 minutes into this video to drop the citation for this article, which is actually really good. Like, no wonder he buried the lead here, because I guarantee you he's not going to be talking about the black contractor who's receiving death threats from the Klan over having dismantled these statues. Yeah, he's trying to say, oh, the wounds of slavery have healed by now. Uh-huh. Sure.
Gigs for obvious reasons, but eventually Democrats in the state landed on a guy named Devin Henry.
Oh, he is. Okay. Prove me wrong, Matt.
Who is willing to destroy them. Quoting from the investigation,
again, Devin Henry, I mean, it's really interesting here. Matt Walsh says he's citing this article, so he's presumably read it. Devin Henry isn't destroying the statues. Devin Henry is disassembling the statues and then moving them to storage, where then the museum can decide whether to destroy the statues or to display them once again. I don't know. It's almost like reading comprehension isn't Matt Walsh's strong suit. But, you know, I guess the reading comprehension of a guy who's more used to burning books than reading them, well, is pretty questionable at best.
Henry estimates that he has dismantled 24 structures between Richmond and Charlottesville. The latter is...
Now that the statues are down, tell us how your life has improved. My life has improved because more messaging in our society should be dedicated towards spreading the message of fuck the Confederacy. Frankly, just having that in my life meaningfully improves it. And I'm glad that taxpayer dollars are going to spread the good news, to spread the gospel of fuck the Confederacy. And you know what? I'm glad that taxpayer dollars are going to not just saying fuck the Confederacy in a symbolic gesture of burning down, statues of Confederate soldiers. I'm also glad that it's saying fuck anyone who supports the Confederacy. I think that's a worthwhile use of my taxpayer money, frankly. Just gotta say. That has meaningfully improved my life.
It's home to the University of Virginia and is one of the cities that acknowledged historical pain and chose to melt down and reuse the materials.
So fuck history then? Nah, just fuck the Confederacy. Hey, guess what? I live in Minnesota. We don't have statues commemorating Confederate soldiers up here in Minnesota, okay? Miraculously, I still learned about the Confederacy and the importance of saying, fuck the Confederacy, fuck slavers, and fuck anyone who still supports the Confederacy in 2023. And if you're coming into my chat to say, but the history, though, fuck you, too. You know, I fuck you, because I think you kind of fall into that category of being supportive of the Confederacy. And guess what? I'm with the majority of this country when I say, go fuck yourself.
Now, they destroyed pretty much every statue remotely associated with the Confederacy. That
Good.
includes a monument to Stonewall Jackson, who likely was a hero of the Mexican-American War.
I don't give a shit about the Mexican-American War. You know what I give a shit about? I give a shit about, that time when a bunch of people in the South decided that they wanted to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans in order to preserve their precious right to own people with darker skin. I think I care about that, and I care about deliberately sending the message, fuck those people. Fuck those people. Expunge them from all places of honor. Okay? We'll remember them as traitors.
Widely regarded as one of the best military commanders in history. Devin Henry also dismantled a monument to the Confederate General A.P. Hill, who also distinguished himself in the war with Mexico. As El País reports, the statue of Hill now has its head, quote, dishonorably stuck in a tire waiting to be wrapped up in white plastic.
How about John Brown
All this to
Robert
say,
E. Lee as the traitor?
I think that's a great revision. This one, thank you for the $10 dono.
they're not putting any of these statues in museums. The museum gambit was always a lie. Something that only...
They're literally all owned by a museum, Matt. All of them, all of these statues are owned by a museum in Richmond, Virginia. The city gave them the statues. Now, maybe, you know what? Maybe Matt Walsh wants to fund the Black History Museum in Richmond, Virginia, so they can have better security and larger display spaces. In which case, more power to him. You know, if that's Matt Walsh's point here, that the Black History Museum needs more funding to expand as a cultural center and touchstone in Richmond, Virginia, so that they can have the security measures and the ability to display these statues, I'm all for that. But something tells me Matt Walsh vehemently does not want that to happen.
Only the most gullible among us could have ever fallen for. And sadly, there are a lot of gullible people among us. Now, that said, there's maybe one exception. The Jefferson Davis statue, post-BLM riots, was taken down and was displayed in the Valentine Museum in Richmond. And this is how it's presented. You can see the picture here. Toppled, desecrated, and covered in graffiti.
Good. I think this sends the appropriate message of fuck the Confederacy. I think this is a great use of this statue.
In the museum. There are many more examples, but you get the point. There was never any intention to memorialize history here. Leftists are doing something...
I mean, Matt, I disagree. I think that statue is doing a great job memorializing history. It's memorializing the history of when America united and said, fuck the Confederacy, and ended slavery. I think that's a great way to commemorate history.
To leaders of the Confederacy that they won't even do to Nazis. Okay, they're erasing them completely. I mean, you could still walk into the World War II museum and see Nazi artifacts if you want, posters.
Hey, guess what, Matt? You can still go into many, many, many museums in America and find Civil War stuff. That's not terribly rare, Matt. You can watch Antiques Roadshow, Matt, and people are just overflowing with Civil War stuff, Matt.
There's flags, weaponry, even Nazi games, board games, but they don't want you seeing any relic.
Nazi board games? What?
Of the Confederacy under any circumstance, whether it's in a museum or not. In fact, even if you agree with removing the Lee statue in Charlottesville, which I don't, but even if you do, you must at least acknowledge that it is a historic artifact. It's literally registered as one. All of the controversy over it just makes it more.
I wonder. Matt, if you want to take that statue as I'm sure like a lot of these people for these statues that you are so preciously holding on to, I'm sure they'd be willing to sell it to you. You wanna use I've seen pictures of Matt Walsh's property. It's large. You got a lot of room there to erect a bunch of statues. Why not buy some of them with that Daily Wire money you're getting paid, Matt? Buy a few of those statues, erect them on your property. Why don't you do that, huh? You use that argument for immigrants. If you like immigrants so much, why don't you let them stay in your house? I've heard you make that argument before. Why don't you buy some of these statues? Give them a place to live near your house.
Historically significant. So there's no valid reason to destroy it. You are literally destroying history when you destroy it. And the destruction is a gratuitous act that can only be meant to send an ideological and political message.
I wonder, the destruction of the statue sends an ideological and political message. Guys, do you think? No. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that erecting a statue also sends an ideological and political message. That couldn't be. No, it is only destroying statues that sends an ideological and political message. Also, yes, destroying statues does do that, and actually in this case, it's good. And, if we burned every single Confederate statue into a massive metal pile in Richmond, Virginia, that would be a better use of all of that material and send a much better message than anything else that metal is doing right now in the form of statues.
And this goes well beyond the Confederacy. That's why the mob quickly moved from the Confederacy to tearing down statues of pretty much any white person who happened to be born prior to the 20th century. Even Teddy Roosevelt fell victim.
You know who wouldn't fall victim, though? John Brown. John Brown? Cool dude. We can erect so many statues of John Brown, okay? He gets the pass. He gets the statue pass.
What this tells us is that leftists are preoccupied, above all, with erasing the history and traditions of this country. It's about power. It's about dominating and humiliating those that they identify as the enemy. And in large...
Well, to be completely accurate, Matt, the Union didn't identify the South as an enemy until the South seceded and declared war on the North. So technically, the South is the one that designated the North the enemy. And I think we should just carry on their very important Confederate tradition by recognizing them as enemies and immolating any of the statues dedicated to them or their cause. I'm just gonna say that.
Large part, they are succeeding. We should remember that we're in this situation now because Republicans across the country, including in Washington, people calling themselves conservatives, that is, the people who are supposed to be conserving things like history, let it happen.
Oh, wait. Matt, if conservatives are supposed to conserve things, do you think that maybe there are some conservatives who want to conserve bad things? Like racism, or Jim Crow, or redlining, or I don't know, symbols related to those things. Nah, it couldn't be. It couldn't be. That's crazy talk.
They were too afraid of being called racist to say anything about it. They were too weak to stand up to this cultural vandalism when it took root. And they're still too weak to stand up for it or to it. If Republicans had any moral fortitude whatsoever, they would respond to the destruction of the Lee statue by painting over every George Floyd mural and tearing down and destroying every single one of his grotesque, disgusting monuments.
The difference is those monuments were like voted in, like the people of the around that live around that area want those monuments to be there, Matt. As opposed to the Robert E. Lee statue, for example, the people who live in Richmond, Virginia, decided they did not want that statue to be there. And furthermore, they decided they were very okay with it being melted down, because again, the museum that currently holds all of these statues asks the residents what they want done with the statues. So that would be a key difference here. Whereas Matt is just advocating for vigilante vandalism, I guess. Property destruction. Careful, Matt. Almost sounds like you're trying to incite a riot.
If Robert E. Lee doesn't deserve to be honored, then a violent drug addict who robbed women and ripped off convenience stores certainly doesn't pass muster.
Well, I'm going to be completely fair here. I think that actually a violent drug addict, even just taking that at face value, is more worthy of respect and admiration and veneration than someone who actively participated in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people in order to preserve slavery. I actually think that, like these two things are not equivalent. And if, George Floyd's personal faults, bar him from being made into a statue, in Matt Walsh's mind, it's incredibly baffling that a guy who literally was responsible for hundreds of thousands of Americans dying in order to try and preserve owning human beings. I think he has a bit more fault here in that equation, which isn't even bringing in the fact that the reason George Floyd is venerated is because he's a symbol of, the brutality and violence of the police state we live in, and the continuing oppression of people based on the color of their skin. That would be, why people make statues honoring him. But,
So throw his busts and golden coffins in the furnace as well.
Guess what, Matt? If you can get someone to, if you can get an entire city of hundreds of thousands of people to vote to do that, guess what? That's how democracy works, bud. But I'm gonna guess that not enough people agree with you on that one, buddy.
But that won't happen, of course.
Because conservatives suck ass and fuck the Confederacy.
Come a very long way since Eisenhower. Unfortunately, we're heading in the wrong direction. And frankly, at this point, it probably won't be long until Eisenhower's memorial is melted down too, especially after they see that video. They'll turn it into an inclusive art display, another display of inclusivity that excludes everyone who disagrees with them.
I mean, I'm okay with excluding people who declared war on their own country, Matt. I'm actually okay with excluding those people from being honored in statues.
That is the left's goal, after all. It's always been their goal. And if we keep electing politicians who are too afraid to say so, then ultimately they will achieve it. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show.
Anyway, I think there's only one proper way we can end this, and that is by, listening to an old classic.
Perfect. Where's my clock? E404 button. Shoot some beat.
Oh, way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battles. Right away, come away, right away, come away. We'll all go down to Dixie, away, away. Each Dixie boy must understand that he must find his Uncle Sam. Away, away, we'll all go down to Dixie. Away, away, we'll all go down to Dixie. Way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battles. Right away, come away, right away, come away. We'll all go down to Dixie, away, away. Each Dixie boy must understand that he must find his Uncle Sam. Away, away, we'll all go down to Dixie. Away, away, we'll all go down to Dixie.
Fuck the Confederacy.